The Finding of the Graiken by William Hope Hodgson. Chapter 1. When a year had passed, and still there was no news of the full-rigged ship Graiken, even the most sanguine of my old chum's friends had ceased to hope, perchance, somewhere, she might be above water. Yet Ned Barlow, in his inmost thoughts, I knew, still hugged to himself the hope that she would win home. Poor dear old fellow! How my heart did go out towards him in his sorrow! For it was in the Graiken that his sweetheart had sailed on that dull January day, some 12 months previously. The voyage had been taken for the sake of her health, yet since then, save for a distant signal recorded at the Azores, there had been from all the mystery of ocean no voice. The ship and they within her had vanished utterly. And still Barlow hoped. He said nothing, actually, but at times his deeper thoughts would float up and show through the sea of his usual talk, and thus I would know, in an indirect way, of the thing that his heart was thinking. Nor was time a healer. It was later that my present good fortune came to me. My uncle died, and I, hitherto poor, was now a rich man. In a breath, it seemed, I had become possessor of houses, lands, and money. Also, in my eyes almost more important, a fine fore-and-aft rigged yacht of some 200 tons register. It seemed scarcely believable that the thing was mine, and I was all in a scutter to run away down to Falmouth and get to sea. In old times, when my uncle had been more than usually gracious, he had invited me to accompany him for a trip round the coast or elsewhere, as the fit might take him. Yet never, even in my most hopeful moments, had it occurred to me that ever she might be mine. And now I was hurrying my preparations for a good long sea trip, for to me the sea is, and always has been, a comrade. Still, with all the prospects before me, I was by no means completely satisfied, for I wanted Ned Barlow with me, and yet was afraid to ask him. I had the feeling that in view of his overwhelming loss, he must positively hate the sea, and yet I could not be happy at the thought of leaving him and going alone. He had not been well lately, and a sea voyage would be the very thing for him, if only it were not going to freshen painful memories. Eventually I decided to suggest it, and this I did a couple of days before the date I had fixed for sailing. "Ned," I said, "you need a change." "Yes," he assented wearily. "Come with me, old chap," I went on, growing bolder. "I'm taking a trip in the yacht. It would be splendid to have—" To my dismay he jumped to his feet and came towards me excitedly. I've upset him now, was my thought. I am a fool. "Go to sea?" he said. "My God, I'd give—" He broke off short and stood suppressed opposite to me, his face all of a quiver with suppressed emotion. He was silent a few seconds, getting himself in hand. Then he proceeded more quietly. "Where to?" "Anywhere," I replied, watching him keenly, for I was greatly puzzled by his manner. "I'm not quite clear yet. Somewhere south of here, the West Indies, I have thought. It's all so new, you know. Just fancy being able to go just where we like. I can hardly realize it yet." I stopped, for he had turned from me and was staring out of the window. "You'll come, Ned?" I cried, fearful that he was going to refuse me. He took a pace away and came back. "I'll come," he said, and there was a look of strange excitement in his eyes that set me off on a tack of vague wonder. But I said nothing, just told him how he had pleased me. Chapter 2. We had been at sea a couple of weeks, and were alone upon the Atlantic, at least so much of it as presented itself to our view. I was leaning over the taffrail, staring down into the boil of the wake. Yet I noticed nothing, for I was wrapped in a tissue of somewhat uncomfortable thought. It was about Ned Barlow. He had been queer, decidedly queer, since leaving port. His whole attitude mentally had been that of a man under the influence of an all-pervading excitement. I had said that he was in need of a change, and had trusted that the splendid tonic of the sea breeze would serve to put him soon to rights mentally and physically. Yet here was the poor old chap acting in a manner calculated to cause me anxiety as to his balance. Scarcely a word had been spoken since leaving the channel. When I ventured to speak to him, often he would take not the least notice. Other times he would answer only by a brief word, but talk never. In addition, his whole time was spent on deck among the men, and with some of them he seemed to converse both long and earnestly, yet to me, his chum and true friend, not a word. Another thing came to me as a surprise. Barlow betrayed the greatest interest in the position of the vessel, and the courses set, all in such a manner as left me no room to doubt but that his knowledge of navigation was considerable. Once I ventured to express my astonishment at this knowledge, and ask a question or two as to the way in which he had gathered it, but had been treated with such an absurdly stony silence that since then I had not spoken to him. With all this, it may be easily conceived that my thoughts, as I stared down into the wake, were troublesome. Suddenly I heard a voice at my elbow. "I should like to have a word with you, sir." I turned sharply. It was my skipper, and something in his face told me that all was not as it should be. "Well, Jenkins, fire away." He looked round, as if afraid of being overheard, then came closer to me. "Someone's been messing with the compasses, sir," he said in a low voice. "What?" I asked sharply. "They've been meddled with, sir. The magnets have been shifted, and by someone who's a good idea of what he's doing." "What on earth do you mean?" I inquired. "Why should anyone mess about with them? What good would it do them?" "You must be mistaken." "No, sir, I'm not. They've been touched within the last 48 hours, and by someone that understands what he's doing." I stared at him. The man was so certain. I felt bewildered. "But why should they?" "That's more than I can say, sir. But it's a serious matter, and I want to know what I'm to do. It looks to me as though there was something funny going on. I'd give a month's pay to know just who it was, for certain." "Well," I said, "if they have been touched, it can only be by one of the officers. You say the chap who has done it must understand what he is doing." He shook his head. "No, sir," he began, and then stopped abruptly. His gaze met mine. I think the same thought must have come to us simultaneously. I gave a little gasp of amazement. He wagged his head at me. "I've had my suspicions for a bit, sir," he went on, "but seeing that he was fairly struck for the moment." I took my weight off the rail and stood upright. "To whom are you referring?" I asked curtly. "Why, sir, to him, Mr. Ned." He would have gone on, but I cut him short. "That will do, Jenkins," I cried. "Mr. Ned Barlow is my friend. You are forgetting yourself a little. You will accuse me of tampering with the compasses next." I turned away, leaving little Captain Jenkins speechless. I had spoken with an almost vehement over-loyalty to quiet my own suspicions. All the same, I was horribly bewildered, not knowing what to think or do or say, so that eventually I did just nothing. Chapter 3. It was early one morning, about a week later, that I opened my eyes abruptly. I was lying on my back in my bunk, and the daylight was beginning to creep wanly in through the ports. I had a vague consciousness that all was not as it should be, and feeling thus, I made to grasp the edge of my bunk and sit up, but failed, owing to the fact that my wrists were securely fastened by a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Utterly confounded, I let my head fall back upon the pillow, and then, in the midst of my bewilderment, there sounded the sharp report of a pistol shot somewhere on the decks over my head. There came a second and the sound of voices and footsteps, and then a long spell of silence. Into my mind had rushed the single word, mutiny. My temples throbbed a little, but I struggled to keep calm and think, and then, all adrift, I fell to searching round for a reason. Who was it, and why? Perhaps an hour passed, during which I asked myself 10,000 vain questions. All at once I heard a key inserted in the door. So I had been locked in. It turned, and the steward walked into the cabin. He did not look at me, but went to the arm rack and began to remove the various weapons. "What the devil is the meaning of all this, Jones?" I roared, getting up a bit on one elbow. "What's happening?" But the fool answered not a word, just went to and fro carrying out the weapons from my cabin into the next, so that at last I ceased from questioning him, and lay silent, promising myself future vengeance. When he had removed the arms, the steward began to go through my table drawers, emptying them, so it appeared to me, of everything that could be used as a weapon or tool. Having completed his task, he vanished, locking the door after him. Some time passed, and at last, about 7 bells, he reappeared, this time bringing a tray with my breakfast. Placing it upon the table, he came across to me and proceeded to unlock the cuffs from off my wrists. Then, for the first time, he spoke. "Mr. Barlow desires me to say, sir, that you have the liberty of your cabin, so long as you will agree not to cause any bother. Should you wish for anything, I am under his orders to supply you." He retreated hastily toward the door. On my part, I was almost speechless with astonishment and rage. "1 minute, Jones," I shouted, just as he was in the act of leaving the cabin. "Kindly explain what you mean. You said Mr. Barlow. Is it to him that I owe all this?" And I waved my hand towards the irons which the man still held. "It is by his orders," replied he, and turned once more to leave the cabin. "I don't understand," I said, bewildered. "Mr. Barlow is my friend, and this is my yacht. By what right do you dare to take your orders from him? Let me out!" As I shouted the last command, I leapt from my bunk and made a dash for the door. But the steward, so far from attempting to bar it, flung it open and stepped quickly through, thus allowing me to see that a couple of the sailors were stationed in the alleyway. "Get on deck at once," I said angrily. "What are you doing down here?" "Sorry, sir," said one of the men. "We'd take it kindly if you'd make no trouble. But we ain't letting you out, sir. Don't make no bloomin' error." I hesitated, then went to the table and sat down. I would at least do my best to preserve my dignity. After an inquiry as to whether he could do anything further, the steward left me to breakfast and my thoughts. As may be imagined, the latter were by no means pleasant. Here was I, prisoner in my own yacht, and by the hand of the very man I had loved and befriended through many years. Oh, it was too incredible and mad. For a while, leaving the table, I paced the deck of my room. Then, growing calmer, I sat down again and attempted to make some sort of a meal. As I breakfasted, my chief thought was as to why my one-time chum was treating me thus, and after that I fell to puzzling how he had managed to get the yacht into his own hands. Many things came back to me: his familiarity with the men, his treatment of me, which I had put down to a temporary want of balance, the fooling with the compasses, for I was certain now that he had been the doer of that piece of mischief. But why? That was the great point. As I turned the matter over in my brain, an incident that had occurred some 6 days back came to me. It had been on the very day after the captain's report to me of the tampering with the compasses. Barlow had for the first time relinquished his brooding and silence, and had started to talk to me, but in such a wild strain that he had made me feel vaguely uncomfortable about his sanity, for he told me some yarn of an idea which he had got into his head. And then, in an overbearing way, he demanded that the navigation of the yacht should be put into his hands. He had been very incoherent, and was plainly in a state of considerable mental excitement. He had rambled on about some derelict, and then had talked in an extraordinary fashion of a vast world of seaweed. Once or twice, in his bewilderingly disconnected speech, he had mentioned the name of his sweetheart, and now it was the memory of her name that gave me the first inkling of what might possibly prove a solution of the whole affair. I wished now that I had encouraged his incoherent ramble of speech, instead of heading him off, but I had done so because I could not bear to have him talk as he had. Yet with the little I remembered, I began to shape out a theory. It seemed to me that he might be nursing some idea that had formed, goodness knows how or when, that his sweetheart, still alive, was aboard some derelict in the midst of an enormous world, he had termed it, of seaweed. He might have grown more explicit had I not attempted to reason with him, and so lost the rest. Yet, remembering back, it seemed to me that he must undoubtedly have meant the enormous Sargasso Sea, that great seaweed-laden ocean, vast almost as continental Europe, and the final resting place of the Atlantic's wreckage. Surely, if he proposed any attempt to search through that, then there could be no doubt but that he was temporarily unbalanced, and yet I could do nothing. I was a prisoner, and helpless. Chapter 4. 8 days of variable but strongish winds passed, and still I was a prisoner in my cabin. From the ports that opened out astern and on each side, for my cabin runs right across the whole width of the stern, I was able to command a good view of the surrounding ocean, which now had commenced to be laden with great floating patches of gulfweed, many of them hundreds and hundreds of yards in length. And still we held on, apparently towards the nucleus of the Sargasso Sea. This I was able to assume by means of a chart which I found in one of the lockers, and the course I had been able to gather from the telltale compass led into the cabin ceiling. And so another and another day went by, and now we were among weeds so thick that at times the vessel found difficulty in forcing her way through, while the surface of the sea had assumed a curious oily appearance, though the wind was still quite strong. It was later in the day that we encountered a bank of weed so prodigious that we had to up-helm and run round it, and after that the same experience was many times repeated, and so the night found us. The following morning found me at the ports, eagerly peering out across the water. From one of those on the starboard side, I could discern at a considerable distance a huge bank of weed that seemed to be unending and to run parallel with our broadside. It appeared to rise in places a couple of feet above the level of the surrounding sea. For a long while I stared, then went across to the port side. Here I found that a similar bank stretched away on our port beam. It was as though we were sailing up an immense river, the low banks of which were formed of seaweed instead of land. And so that day passed hour by hour, the weed banks growing more definite and seeming to be nearer. Towards evening something came into sight, a far, dim hulk, the masts gone, the whole hull covered with growth, an unwholesome green blotched with brown in the light from the dying sun. I saw this lonesome craft from a port on the starboard side, and the sight roused a multitude of questions and thoughts. Evidently we had penetrated into the unknown central portion of the enormous Sargasso, the great eddy of the Atlantic, and this was some lonely derelict, lost ages ago perhaps to the outside world. Just at the going down of the sun I saw another. She was nearer, and still possessed two of her masts, which stuck up bare and desolate into the darkening sky. She could not have been more than a quarter of a mile in from the edge of the weed. As we passed her, I craned out my head through the port to stare at her. As I stared, the dusk grew out of the abyss of the air, and she faded presently from sight into the surrounding loneliness. Through all that night I sat at the port and watched, listening and peering, for the tremendous mystery of that inhuman weed world was upon me. In the air there rose no sound. Even the wind was scarcely more than a low hum aloft among the sails and gear, and under me the oily water gave no rippling noise. All was silence, supreme and unearthly. About midnight the moon rose away on our starboard beam, and from then until the dawn I stared out upon a ghostly world of noiseless weed, fantastic, silent, and unbelievable, under the moonlight. On 4 separate occasions my gaze lit on black hulks that rose above the surrounding weeds, the hulks of long-lost vessels. And once, just when the strangeness of dawn was in the sky, a faint, long-drawn wailing seemed to come floating to me across the immeasurable waste of weed. It startled my strung nerves, and I assured myself that it was the cry of some lone sea-bird. Yet my imagination reached out for some stranger explanation. The eastward sky began to flush with the dawn, and the morning light grew subtly over the breadth of the enormous ocean of weed, until it seemed to me to reach away unbroken on each beam into the gray horizons. Only astern of us, like a broad road of oil, ran the strange river-like gulf up which we had sailed. Now I noticed that the banks of weed were nearer, very much nearer, and a disagreeable thought came to me. This vast rift that had allowed us to penetrate into the very nucleus of the Sargasso Sea, suppose it should close? It would mean inevitably that there would be one more among the missing, another unanswered mystery of the inscrutable ocean. I resisted the thought and came back more directly into the present. Evidently the wind was still dropping, for we were moving slowly, as a glance at the ever-nearing weed banks told me. The hours passed on, and my breakfast, when the steward brought it, I took to one of the ports, and there ate, for I would lose nothing of the strange surroundings into which we were so steadily plunging. And so the morning passed. Chapter 5. It was about an hour after dinner that I observed the open channel between the weed banks to be narrowing almost minute by minute with uncomfortable speed. I could do nothing except watch and surmise. At times I felt convinced that the immense masses of weed were closing in upon us, but I fought off the thought with the more hopeful one that we were surely approaching some narrowing outlet of the gulf that yawned so far across the seaweed. By the time the afternoon was half through, the weed banks had approached so close that occasional outjutting masses scraped the yacht's sides in passing. It was now, with the stuff below my face, within a few feet of my eyes, that I discovered the immense amount of life that stirred among all the hideous waste. Innumerable crabs crawled among the seaweed, and once, indistinctly, something stirred among the depths of a large outlying tuft of weed. What it was I could not tell, though afterwards I had an idea, but all I saw was something dark and glistening. We were past it before I could see more. The steward was in the act of bringing in my tea, when from above there came a noise of shouting, and almost immediately a slight jolt. The man put down the tray he was carrying and glanced at me with startled expression. "What is it, Jones?" I questioned. "I don't know, sir. I expect it's the weed," he replied. I ran to the port, craned out my head, and looked forward. Our bow seemed to be embedded in a mass of weeds, and as I watched, it came further aft. Within the next 5 minutes, we had driven through it into a circle of sea that was free from the weed. Across this we seemed to drift rather than sail, so slow was our speed. Upon its opposite margin, we brought up the vessel, swinging broadside onto the weed, being secured thus with a couple of kedges cast from the bows and stern, though of this I was not aware until later. As we swung, and at last I was able from my port to see ahead, I saw a thing that amazed me. There, not 300 feet distant across the quaking weed, a vessel lay embedded. She had been a three-master, but of these only the mizzen was standing. For perhaps a minute I stared, scarcely breathing in my exceeding interest. All around, above her bulwarks, to the height of apparently some 10 feet, ran a sort of fencing, formed, so far as I could make out, from canvas, rope, and spars. Even as I wondered at the use of such a thing, I heard my chum's voice overhead. He was hailing her. "Graiken, ahoy!" he shouted. "Graiken, ahoy!" At that I fairly jumped. Graiken? What could he mean? I stared out of the port. The blaze of the sinking sun flashed redly upon her stern, and showed the lettering of her name in port, yet the distance was too great for me to read. I ran across to my table to see if there were a pair of binoculars in the drawers. I found one in the first I opened, then I ran back to the port, racking them out as I went. I reached it and clapped them to my eyes. Yes, I saw it plainly, her name Graiken, and her port London. From her name my gaze moved to that strange fencing about her. There was a movement in the aft part. As I watched, a portion of it slid to one side, and a man's head and shoulders appeared. I nearly yelled with the excitement of that moment. I could scarcely believe the thing I saw. The man waved an arm, and a vague hail reached us across the weed, then he disappeared. A moment later, a score of people crowded the opening, and among them I made out distinctly the face and figure of a girl. He was right after all, I heard myself saying out loud in a voice that was toneless through very amazement. In a minute I was at the door, beating it with my fists. "Let me out, Ned, let me out!" I shouted. I felt that I could forgive him all the indignity that I had suffered. Nay, more. In a queer way, I had a feeling that it was I who needed to ask him for forgiveness. All my bitterness had gone, and I wanted only to be out and give a hand in the rescue. Yet though I shouted, no one came, so that at last I returned quickly to the port to see what further developments there were. Across the weed I now saw that one man had his hands up to his mouth shouting. His voice reached me only as a faint hoarse cry. The distance was too great for anyone aboard the yacht to distinguish its import. From the derelict, my attention was drawn abruptly to a scene alongside. A plank was thrown down onto the weed, and the next moment I saw my chum swing himself down the side and leap upon it. I had opened my mouth to call out to him that I would forgive all were I but freed to lend a hand in this unbelievable rescue. But even as the words formed, they died, for though the weed appeared so dense, it was evidently incapable of bearing any considerable weight, and the plank, with Barlow upon it, sank down into the weed almost to his waist. He turned and grabbed at the rope with both hands, and in the same moment he gave a loud cry of sheer terror and commenced to scramble up the yacht's side. As his feet drew clear of the weed, I gave a short cry. Something was curled about his left ankle, something oily, supple, and tapered. As I stared, another rose up out from the weed and swayed through the air, made a grab at his leg, missed, and appeared to wave aimlessly. Others came towards him as he struggled upwards. Then I saw hands reach down from above and seize Barlow beneath the arms. They lifted him by main force, and with a mass of weed that enfolded something leathery, from which numbers of curling arms writhed. A hand slashed down with a sheath knife, and the next instant the hideous thing had fallen back among the weed. For a couple of seconds longer I remained, my head twisted upwards. Then faces appeared once more over our rail, and I saw the men extending arms and fingers, pointing. From above me there rose a hoarse chorus of fear and wonder, and I turned my head swiftly to glance down and across that treacherous, extraordinary weed world. The whole of the hitherto silent surface was all of a move in one stupendous undulation, as though life had come to all that desolation. The undulatory movement continued, and abruptly, in 100 places, the seaweed was tossed up into sudden billowy hillocks. From these burst mighty arms, and in an instant the evening air was full of them, hundreds and hundreds, coming toward the yacht. "Devilfishes!" shouted a man's voice from the deck. "Octopuses! My God!" Then I caught my chum shouting. "Cut the mooring ropes!" he yelled. This must have been done almost on the instant, for immediately there showed between us and the nearest weed a broadening gap of scummy water. "Haul away, lads!" I heard Barlow shouting, and the same instant I caught the splash of something in the water on our port side. I rushed across and looked out. I found that a rope had been carried across to the opposite seaweed, and that the men were now warping us rapidly from those invading horrors. I raced back to the starboard port, and lo, as though by magic, there stretched between us and the Graiken only the silent stretch of demure weed and some 50 feet of water. It seemed inconceivable that it was a covering to so much terror. And then speedily the night was upon us, hiding all. But from the decks above there commenced a sound of hammering that continued long throughout the night, long after I, weary with my previous night's vigil, had passed into a fitful slumber, broken anon by that hammering above. Chapter 6. "Your breakfast, sir?" came respectfully enough in the steward's voice, and I woke with a start. Overhead there still sounded that persistent hammering, and I turned to the steward for an explanation. "I don't exactly know, sir," was his reply. "It's something the carpenter's doing to one of the lifeboats." And then he left me. I ate my breakfast, standing at the port, staring at the distant Graiken. The weed was perfectly quiet, and we were lying about the center of the little lake. As I watched the derelict, it seemed to me that I saw a movement about her side, and I reached for the glasses. Adjusting them, I made out that there were several of the cuttlefish attached to her in different parts, their arms spread out almost starwise across the lower portions of her hull. Occasionally a feeler would detach itself and wave aimlessly. This it was that had drawn my attention. The sight of these creatures, in conjunction with that extraordinary scene the previous evening, enabled me to guess the use of the great screen running about the Graiken. It had obviously been erected as a protection against the vile inhabitants of that strange weed world. From that my thoughts passed to the problem of reaching and rescuing the crew of the derelict. I could by no means conceive how this was to be effected. As I stood pondering whilst I ate, I caught the voices of men chantying on deck. For a while this continued. Then came Barlow's voice shouting orders, and almost immediately a splash in the water on the starboard side. I poked my head out through the port and stared. They had got one of the lifeboats into the water. To the gunwale of the boat they had added a superstructure ending in a roof, the whole somewhat resembling a gigantic dog kennel. From under the two sharp ends of the boat rose a couple of planks at an angle of 30 degrees. These appeared to be firmly bolted to the boat and the superstructure. I guessed that their purpose was to enable the boat to override the seaweed instead of plowing into it and getting fast. In the stern of the boat was fixed a strong ring-bolt, into which was spliced the end of a coil of 1-inch manila rope. Along the sides of the boat and high above the gunwale, the superstructure was pierced with holes for oars. In one side of the roof was placed a trapdoor. The idea struck me as wonderfully ingenious, and a very probable solution of the difficulty of rescuing the crew of the Graiken. A few minutes later, one of the men threw over a rope onto the roof of the boat. He opened the trap and lowered himself into the interior. I noticed that he was armed with one of the yacht's cutlasses and a revolver. It was evident that my chum fully appreciated the difficulties that were to be overcome. In a few seconds, the man was followed by 4 others of the crew, similarly armed, and then Barlow. Seeing him, I craned my head as far as possible and sang out to him, "Ned! Ned, old man!" I shouted. "Let me come along with you!" He appeared never to have heard me. I noticed his face just before he shut down the trap above him. The expression was fixed and peculiar. It had the uncomfortable remoteness of a sleepwalker. "Confound it," I muttered, and after that I said nothing, for it hurt my dignity to supplicate before the men. From the interior of the boat I heard Barlow's voice, muffled. Immediately 4 oars were passed out through the holes in the sides, while from slots in the front and rear of the superstructure were thrust a couple of oars with wooden chocks nailed to the blades. These, I guessed, were intended to assist in steering the boat, that in the bow being primarily for pressing down the weed before the boat, so as to allow her to surmount it the more easily. Another muffled order came from the interior of the queer-looking craft, and immediately the 4 oars dipped, and the boat shot towards the weed, the rope trailing out astern as it was paid out from the deck above me. The board-assisted bow of the lifeboat took the weed with a sort of squashy surge, rose up, and the whole craft appeared to leap from the water down in among the quaking mass. I saw now the reason why the oar-holes had been placed so high, for of the boat itself nothing could be seen, only the upper portion of the superstructure wallowing amid the weed. Had the holes been lower, there would have been no handling the oars. I settled myself to watch. There was the probability of a prodigious spectacle, and as I could not help, I would at least use my eyes. 5 minutes passed, during which nothing happened, and the boat made slow progress towards the derelict. She had accomplished perhaps some 20 or 30 yards, when suddenly from the Graiken there reached my ears a hoarse shout. My glance leapt from the boat to the derelict. I saw that the people aboard had the sliding part of the screen to one side and were waving their arms frantically, as though motioning the boat back. Amongst them I could see the girlish figure that had attracted my attention the previous evening. For a moment I stared, then my gaze traveled back to the boat. All was quiet. The boat had now covered a quarter of the distance, and I began to persuade myself that she would get across without being attacked. Then, as I gazed anxiously, from a point in the weed a little ahead of the boat there came a sudden quaking ripple that shivered through the weed in a sort of queer tremor. The next instant, like a shot from a gun, a huge mass drove up clear through the tangled weed, hurling it in all directions and almost capsizing the boat. The creature had driven up rear foremost. It fell back with a mighty splash, and in the same moment its monstrous arms were reached out to the boat. They grasped it, enfolding themselves about it horribly. It was apparently attempting to drag the boat under. From the boat came a regular volley of revolver shots, yet though the brute writhed, it did not relinquish its hold. The shots closed, and I saw the dull flash of cutlass blades. The men were attempting to hack at the thing through the oar-holes, but evidently with little effect. All at once, the enormous creature seemed to make an effort to overturn the boat. I saw the half-submerged boat go over to one side, until it seemed to me that nothing could right it, and at the sight I went mad with excitement to help them. I pulled my head in from the port and glanced round the cabin. I wanted to break down the door, but there was nothing with which to do this. Then my sight fell on my bunkboard, which fitted into a sliding groove. It was made of teakwood and very solid and heavy. I lifted it out and charged the door with the end of it. The panels split from top to bottom, for I am a heavy man. Again I struck and drove the 2 portions of the door apart. I hove down the bunkboard and rushed through. There was no one on guard. Evidently they had gone on deck to view the rescue. The gun-room door was to my right, and I had the key in my pocket. In an instant I had it open and was lifting down from its rack a heavy elephant gun. Seizing a box of cartridges, I tore off the lid and emptied the lot into my pocket. Then I leapt up the companionway on the deck. The steward was standing near. He turned at my step, his face was white, and he took a couple of paces towards me doubtfully. There, he began, but I never let him finish. Get out of my way, I roared, and swept him to one side. I ran forward. Haul in on that rope, I shouted. Tail onto it. Are you going to stand there like a lot of owls and see them drown? The men only wanted a leader to show them what to do, and without showing any thought of insubordination, they tacked onto the rope that was fastened to the stern of the boat and hauled her back across the weed, cuttlefish and all. The strain on the rope had thrown her on an even keel again, so that she took the water safely, though that foul thing was straddled all across her. Vast hauling, I shouted. Get the dock's cleavers, some of you. Anything that'll cut. This is the sort, sir, cried the boatswain. From somewhere he had got hold of a formidable double-bladed whale lance. The boat, still under the impetus given by our pull, struck the side of the yacht immediately beneath where I was waiting with the gun. Astern of it towed the body of the monster, its two eyes, monstrous orbs of the profound, staring out vilely from behind its arms. I leant my elbows on the rail and aimed full at the right eye. As I pulled on the trigger, one of the great arms detached itself from the boat and swirled up towards me. There was a thunderous bang as the heavy charge drove its way through that vast eye, and at the same instant something swept over my head. There came a cry from behind, "Look out, sir!" A flame of steel before my eyes, and a truncated something fell upon my shoulder and thence to the deck. Down below, the water was being churned to a froth, and 3 more arms sprang into the air and then down among us. One grasped the boatswain, lifting him like a child. 2 cleavers gleamed, and he fell to the deck from a height of some 12 feet, along with the severed portion of the limb. I had my weapons reloaded again by now, and ran forward along the deck somewhat, to be clear of the flying arms that flailed on the rails and deck. I fired again into the hulk of the brute, and then again. At the second shot, the murderous din of the creature ceased, and with an ineffectual flicker of its remaining tentacles, it sank out of sight beneath the water. A minute later, we had the hatch in the roof of the superstructure open, and the men out, my chum coming last. They had been mightily shaken, but otherwise were none the worse. As Barlow came over the gangway, I stepped up to him and gripped his shoulder. I was strangely muddled in my feelings. I felt that I had no sure position aboard my own yacht, yet all I said was, "Thank God you're safe, old man," and I meant it from my heart. He looked at me in a doubtful, puzzled sort of manner, and passed his hand across his forehead. "Yes," he replied, but his voice was strangely toneless, save that some puzzledness seemed to have crept into it. For a couple of moments he stared at me in an unseeing way, and once more I was struck by the immobile, tensed-up expression of his features. Immediately afterwards he turned away, having shown neither friendliness nor enmity, and commenced to clamber back over the side into the boat. "Come up, Ned," I cried. "It's no good. You'll never manage it that way. Look!" And I stretched out my arm, pointing. Instead of looking, he passed his hand once more across his forehead with that gesture of puzzled doubt. Then, to my relief, he caught at the rope ladder and commenced to make his way slowly up the side. Reaching the deck, he stood for nearly a minute without saying a word, his back turned to the derelict. Then, still wordless, he walked slowly across to the opposite side and leant his elbows upon the rail, as though looking back along the way the yacht had come. For my part, I said nothing, dividing my attention between him and the men, with occasional glances at the quaking weed and the apparently hopelessly surrounded Graiken. The men were quiet, occasionally turning towards Barlow, as though for some further order. Of me they appeared to take little notice. In this wise, perhaps a quarter of an hour went by. Then abruptly Barlow stood upright, waving his arms and shouting, "It comes! It comes!" He turned towards us, and his face seemed transfigured, his eyes gleaming almost maniacally. I ran across the deck to his side and looked away to port, and now I saw what it was that had excited him. The weed barrier through which we had come on our inward journey was divided, a slowly broadening river of oil water showing clean across it. Even as I watched, it grew broader, the immense masses of weed being moved by some unseen impulsion. I was still staring, amazed, when a sudden cry went up from some of the men to starboard. Turning quickly, I saw that the yawning movement was being continued to the mass of weed that lay between us and the Graiken. Slowly the weed was divided, surely as though an invisible wedge were being driven through it. The gulf of weed-clear water reached the derelict and passed beyond, and now there was no longer anything to stop our rescue of the crew of the derelict. Chapter 7. It was Barlow's voice that gave the order for the mooring ropes to be cast off, and then as the light wind was right against us, a boat was out ahead, and the yacht was towed towards the ship, whilst a dozen of the men stood ready with their rifles on the forecastle head. As we drew nearer, I began to distinguish the features of the crew, the men strangely grizzled and old-looking, and among them, white-faced with emotion, was my chum's lost sweetheart. I never expect to know a more extraordinary moment. I looked at Barlow. He was staring at the white-faced girl with an extraordinary fixity of expression that was scarcely the look of a sane man. The next minute we were alongside, crushing to a pulp between our steel sides one of those remaining monsters of the deep that had continued to cling steadfastly to the Graiken. Yet of that I was scarcely aware, for I had turned again to look at Ned Barlow. He was swaying slowly to his feet, and just as the two vessels closed, he reached up both hands to his head and fell like a log. Brandy was brought, and later Barlow carried to his cabin, yet we had won clear of that hideous weed world before he recovered consciousness. During his illness, I learned from his sweetheart how, on a terrible night a long year previously, the Graiken had been caught in a tremendous storm and dismasted, and how, helpless and driven by the gale, they at last found themselves surrounded by the great banks of floating weed, and finally held fast in the remorseless grip of the dread Sargasso. She told me of their attempts to free the ship from the weed, and of the attacks of the cuttlefish, and later of various other matters, for all of which I have no room in this story. In return, I told her of our voyage and our lover's strange behavior, how he had wanted to undertake the navigation of the yacht, and had talked of a great world of weed, how I had, believing him unhinged, refused to listen to him, how he had taken matters into his own hands, without which she would most certainly have ended her days surrounded by the quaking weed and those great beasts of the deep waters. She listened with an ever-growing seriousness, so that I had time and again to assure her that I bore my old chum no ill, but rather held myself to be in the wrong, at which she shook her head, but seemed mightily relieved. It was during Barlow's recovery that I made the astonishing discovery that he remembered no detail of his imprisoning of me. I am convinced now that for days and weeks he must have lived in a sort of dream in a hyper-state, in which I can only imagine that he had possibly been sensitive to more subtle understandings than normal bodily and mental health allows. One other thing there is in closing. I found that the captain and the two mates had been confined to their cabins by Barlow. The captain was suffering from a pistol shot in the arm, due to his having attempted to resist Barlow's assumption of authority. When I released him, he vowed vengeance. Yet Ned Barlow being my chum, I found means to slake both the captain's and the two mates' thirst for vengeance, and the slaking thereof is, well, another story.